The year is 2025, and something huge, yet invisible, has just happened. The kind of event that never makes the evening news, never appears in headlines, never becomes a political debate, but it should, because the agreement that upheld the global economy for half a century has simply expired. With no warning, no replacement, no plan B. For 50 years, every drop of oil sold on the planet was priced in dollars. Every country, from the richest to the most desperate, was forced to use American currency to buy the energy that keeps factories running, homes heated, armies operational. This arrangement turned the dollar into an empire, not because it was strong, but because it was necessary. Not because it was valuable, but because it was unavoidable, until now. The treaty that gave birth to the Petrodollar, the silent pillar supporting the American standard of living, is dead. And most people have no idea what that means. Because if they did, they would instantly understand why their wages don't keep up with prices, why the cost of living is exploding out of control, and why the promise of economic stability was just that, a promise. The truth is that the deal was never meant to be eternal. Even the architects of the system knew it had an expiration date. The problem is that when the clock finally hit zero, no one told the public. Not by accident, but because admitting reality would mean acknowledging that the structure that made the United States the dominant force in the world is collapsing. And the fall will not be slow. Because to understand what is crumbling now, you need to understand why the system existed in the first place, and how it was born from a gesture as simple as it was devastating, made on an August night in 1971. And that's where the story truly begins. To understand the silent collapse of 2025, we need to go back to a Sunday in August 1971, a moment as discrete as it was explosive in global economic history. It was nighttime when President Richard Nixon appeared on television with a rehearsed speech, firm voice, and calculated expression. He announced to the world that the United States was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. That word, temporarily, would change everything. Until that announcement, the dollar had a physical backing. It was a receipt, a promise that each note had an equivalent stored in Fort Knox. But in the years leading up to the speech, Washington had spent far more than it could afford. Costly wars, social programs, global expansion, while real gold flowed out of U.S. vaults at an alarming rate. Countries began to notice the imbalance. France, Germany, and others demanded to exchange their dollars for gold before the ship sank. Nixon decided to slam the door shut. With just a few minutes of airtime, he turned the dollar into pure paper, a currency without an anchor, without a precious metal, supported only by faith in the American government. Economists around the world immediately understood the impact. Without gold, the dollar would only have value as long as other nations believed in it. And that's where the problem began. Because the government knew that international confidence wouldn't last long, not with growing deficits, rising inflation, and a currency backed by nothing but political promises. The U.S. needed a new pillar, something that would force the planet to use dollars even without gold, something even more powerful than metal, capable of replacing gold as the foundation of the world economic order. Then an opportunity, as dangerous as it was brilliant, emerged in the deserts of Arabia, a deal that would redefine global power, create invisible dependencies, and pave the way for the consequences we are feeling now in 2025. The year was 1974. The world was still recovering from the shock caused by the end of the gold standard, and the dollar's credibility was shaking like never before. It was in this vulnerable moment that Henry Kissinger traveled to the Middle East, not just as a diplomat, but as the silent architect of the greatest economic redesign of the modern era. The setting was perfect and explosive at the same time. The 1973 oil embargo had paralyzed the West. Gas stations faced endless lines, and the global economy was kneeling before a single brutal fact. Whoever controlled energy controlled the world, and no one controlled more energy than Saudi Arabia. Kissinger knew this. He also knew that without gold, the dollar desperately needed a new foundation, something that would make it indispensable to any country that wanted to survive economically. And then came the idea that would change history, turning energy into monetary collateral. The negotiations were secret, tense, and wrapped in layers of geopolitical interests. The agreement was simple on the surface, but brilliantly calculated underneath. Saudi Arabia would sell all its oil exclusively in dollars. Not gold, not European currencies, not parallel contracts. Only dollars. In return, Washington would offer unrestricted military protection, strategic cooperation, and support for the Saudi regime in a volatile region filled with enemies, tribal rivalries, and nuclear ambitions. But there was one detail that made this pact even more powerful. Saudi Arabia wasn't just an exporter, it was the heart of OPEC. And where Saudi Arabia went, the others followed. Within a few years, almost all of the world's oil was priced in dollars. And with that, a new era began. The dollar became the bloodstream of the planet. What no one realized at the time was that this pact made in the desert would eventually create the economic desert now beginning to swallow America in 2025. But before the decline became visible, another silent transformation was already underway. When the oil agreement took hold, the world didn't immediately realize what had happened. But quietly, something extraordinary began to form. A financial empire so powerful it surpassed armies, treaties, and borders. For the first time in history, a nation controlled not just a currency, but the very respiratory system of the global economy. Because the side effect of the pact was simple and devastating. To buy energy, every country on the planet needed dollars before anything else. This turned the American currency into a kind of economic passport. Japan, Germany, Brazil, France, Korea, Mexico all had an artificial, continuous, and mandatory need to accumulate dollars. This caused central banks around the world to stockpile U.S. currency as a strategic reserve. And to store those dollars, they all bought the same thing, U.S. Treasury bonds. It was genius engineering. The world needed dollars. It bought U.S. bonds. It financed America's deficits. It strengthened the dollar even further. It increased global dependence. Meanwhile, the U.S. economy began operating under a unique, unprecedented, and deeply unequal logic. The U.S. consumed, printed, and borrowed, and the rest of the world paid the bill without questioning it. Americans enjoyed cheap imports, low inflation, and abundant credit. Wars, social programs, and financial bailouts were funded effortlessly, and all of this happened because other nations were trapped in the mechanism they themselves helped sustain. The foundation of this empire was not gold nor industrial production. It was belief and imposed dependence. A castle made of paper, supported by oil and confidence. And for 50 years, no one imagined that this castle could collapse. It was in 2023 that the first serious tremor hit the structure that had supported the dollar for half a century. There were no emergency speeches, no televised meetings with world leaders. The event passed almost unnoticed by the public, but it echoed like a silent earthquake among central banks, sovereign funds, and analysts who truly understand how the world works. Saudi Arabia, the pillar that anchored the entire architecture of the petrodollar, quietly announced that it would not renew the agreement requiring its oil sales to be conducted exclusively in dollars. No alarm sounded, but it should have. For the first time since 1974, the planet's main energy supplier was free to sell oil and other currencies. And it wasn't just freedom, it was intention. Riyadh was already accepting China's yuan, discussing rupee payments with India, negotiating strategic partnerships with Russia, and formally joining the BRICS bloc, a group created with a clear mission to detach the world from the dollar. This shift triggered a chain reaction. Countries with massive reserves began reviewing their vaults. China accelerated its sale of U.S. bonds. Russia had already liquidated almost everything. India, Brazil, Turkey, and even European allies began to diversify. The percentage of global reserves held in dollars, which for decades floated comfortably above 70%, was now plunging at an alarming and unprecedented rate. The world wasn't just buying fewer dollars, the world was giving up on them. And this abandonment has an inevitable effect. When global demand for currency falls, that currency comes home. And when trillions of dollars return all at once to a country drowning in debt, dependent on imports and facing rising costs of living, the impact hits the ordinary citizen, not the elites. When global demand for dollars weakens, the impact doesn't show up first on Wall Street or in closed-door Federal Reserve meetings. It shows up on the dinner table, at grocery store aisles, at the gas pump, at the pharmacy. And every person feels this impact directly, brutally, and inevitably. For decades, the American economy functioned like a giant standing on clay legs, but legs that were supported by the rest of the world. While countries stockpiled dollars and bought U.S. Treasury bonds, American inflation was exported. The money printed in Washington didn't circulate only within the United States. It spread across the planet, softening its effects at home. But when the world begins reducing reserves, selling treasuries, and trading energy and other currencies, the dynamic flips. Suddenly, the dollars come back home. This return isn't symbolic. It's mathematical. More dollars competing for the same goods means one thing: accelerated inflation. Not that manageable 5% or 8% inflation, but the uncontrolled kind that erodes wages in real time and turns the middle class into a historical concept. Imported goods, electronics, clothing, medicine, car parts, become unaffordable. Energy prices spike. Companies must pass on costs. Salaries don't keep up. Credit cards max out. Savings evaporate. And the government? It faces a dead-end dilemma. If it raises interest rates, it destroys the economy. If it prints more money, it fuels the inflationary fire. If it tries price controls, it causes shortages. There is no good, clean, or politically acceptable solution. The ordinary citizen, who lived 50 years under an artificially stable system, must now face a reality no one prepared him for. Life is getting more expensive, and it will continue to get more expensive, even if he does everything right. From this point on, the problem stops being merely economic and begins transforming into something much bigger, a systemic risk. When an empire loses control of its own currency, it's not just the economy that collapses, it's the very structure of society. Every institution, every contract, every promise that sustains daily life depends on a simple belief that money will hold its value tomorrow. When that belief disappears, everything around it begins to crumble with terrifying speed. The United States has faced crises before. It has endured recessions, wars, bubbles, and financial panics. But all those shocks had one thing in common. They happened within a system in which the dollar was the central axis of the world. Now, for the first time in 8 decades, the country enters turmoil without that privilege. And what happens when an empire loses the privilege of issuing the currency everyone wants? It loses time. It loses leverage. It loses power. The gigantic debt that once seemed manageable becomes a crushing burden. The ability to finance wars, maintain global bases, support social programs, and guarantee internal stability becomes dependent on money that loses value each passing day. The government tries to respond, but every response deepens the problem, freezing the financial system, restricting capital, imposing controls, monitoring transactions, not out of malice, but out of desperation. And while the state struggles to survive, the population awakens to a new reality. The future they imagined no longer exists. The economic model that supported 2 generations has evaporated, not by accident, but by consequence. Mathematics always wins. And it is in this scenario that history offers its most brutal and most liberating insight. Currencies die, empires fall, but those who see it coming survive and prosper. The petrodollar is dead. American hegemony is cracking. And the world is entering a new era, not because anyone wants it, but because every era before this one ended exactly the same way. The only question that remains is not whether you are ready. It's how you will act now that you finally understand what is happening.